Okay, well, good morning. I'm Steve Pfeiffer. I'm here at the Center for International Security and Cooperation as a William Perry Fellow, and I'll be moderating today's session of the European Security Initiative, where we're going to talk about the Russia-Ukraine war and would Vladimir Putin use nuclear weapons. The war is now in month number 4. Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24. And from the original invasion, it looked like the Russian hope was to quickly take Kyiv and occupy perhaps the eastern 2/3 of Ukraine. But it became fairly clear that that was beyond the capabilities of Russian conventional forces. Already at the end of March, they were withdrawing from northern Ukraine, and they've now been focusing on Donbass, where they've been making some progress, but probably a lot slower than the Russian military has hoped. Now, behind all this, of course, is the nuclear question. On February 27, Vladimir Putin said he was putting Russian nuclear forces on special alert. And you've seen other Russian officials, for example, Foreign Minister Lavrov, he's kind of been all over the place on the nuclear question, sometimes dismissing the concern, but other times sort of implying that the threat is there. And meanwhile, on Russian television, Russian TV pundits have been almost rabid on the question, gleefully showing films of Russian nuclear weapons generating radioactive tidal waves that submerge all of the British islands. I guess the good news here is, though, that despite the announcement by the Russians of a nuclear alert, the Pentagon says it has seen no indication of change in Russia's nuclear posture. And I just make a couple observations. It seems to me that Vladimir Putin, historically, and David, you may want to address this in a little bit more detail, talks a lot about nuclear weapons. And I think part of that may well be, even when he's not making nuclear threats, is because his image of Russia as a great power, talking about nuclear weapons makes sense because nuclear weapons is likely Russia's biggest claim to great power status. So looking at this, we're going to today to ask the question, is the talk about nuclear use in Russia, is that simply to intimidate Ukraine and the West, or is there something more behind it? And I'm delighted to have 3 CISAC scholars with me today to talk about these questions. I'll do brief introductions. First, Dr. David Holloway is a Raymond A. Spruance Professor of International History here at Stanford. His research focus is the international history of nuclear weapons. He also works on science and technology in the Soviet Union, and he's author of Stalin and the Bomb: How the Soviet Union got its first nuclear weapons. We also have Dr. Scott Sagan, who's the Carolyn S.G. Monroe Professor of Political Science and also co-director of CISAC. He's advised the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and the National Nuclear Labs on nuclear weapons issues. And his research focus of late has been on nuclear strategy and also the ethics of nuclear use. And our third speaker is Rose Gottemoeller. She is the Stephen C. Hazy Lecturer here at the Freeman Spogli Institute and also a senior fellow at CISAC. She is the formerly Deputy Secretary General of Nato, and before that, she was the Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security, and she was the Chief U.S. Negotiator for the New START Treaty. And here at CISAC, she focuses on nuclear weapons, NATO, and Russia. So what we'll do is we'll have each of the speakers make some opening comments. We'll then get into questions and discussion. If you're watching on Zoom, please put your questions in the Q&A session, and we'll try to monitor those and get to as many as we can. So David, let me start with you. If you could talk a little bit about how Russian nuclear doctrine, what it says, and how Putin's comments of the last 3 or 4 months fit into that context.
Right, thanks, Steve. So the question you've given us is not, will Putin go nuclear, but would Putin go nuclear, which implies a conditional clause. What would Putin go nuclear if? And I want to make 4 points. I'm not sure I'll be able to fill in the conditional clause completely, but maybe these points will help in thinking about it. And the first is, I think there is already a very important nuclear dimension to the crisis. Russian nuclear weapons have been on everyone's mind. There's no evidence that they've inhibited Ukrainian military actions, but the fear of war with Russia, which of course includes a nuclear dimension, has inhibited the US and NATO. Putin and other leaders, Russian leaders, have emphasized the danger of escalation to nuclear use. And let me quote from Putin's February 24th speech launching the special military operation. I would now like to say something very important for those who may be tempted to interfere in these developments from the outside. No matter who tries to stand in our way, or all the more so create threats for our country and our people, they must know that Russia will respond immediately, and the consequences will be such as you have never seen in your entire history, which I think was read and intended as a reference to nuclear weapons. But the point here, it was not directed at Ukraine. It was directed at the United States and at NATO. So interference from outside. So the intention here is pretty clear, and I think it has presented the West with a dilemma, and in some ways an awkward one. So how much can Western powers do before crossing the red line? And among the limitations that NATO and the US have already adopted are no boots on the ground in Ukraine, no no-fly zone, no fighter aircraft provided, and now, as we know from today's decision and the article by President Biden in the New York Times, no long-range missiles that can strike Russian territory. So other factors, no doubt, enter into these decisions, but the nuclear factor is undoubtedly important. And President Biden's piece, I think, tries to draw a line beyond which the US and its allies will not go. So in some sense, it's both a threat or a response to Russia for what it has done in Ukraine, but it's also a reassurance. And that was, this war is to be a limited war. And at the same time in the article, he warns that any use of nuclear weapons in this conflict on any scale would be completely unacceptable to us as well as the rest of the world and would entail severe consequences. And then a few hours later, Russia announced that it would have an exercise involving strategic missiles, though not a launch of the missiles, I believe. So what does Russian doctrine say? The Russian decree on the foundations of state policy of the Russian Federation in the sphere of nuclear deterrence from a couple of years ago says that Russia reserves the right to use nuclear weapons in two circumstances. One, in response to a nuclear attack or an attack with weapons of mass destruction against it or its allies. And secondly, in the case, and I quote, in the case of aggression against the Russian Federation with the use of conventional weapons when the very existence of the state is put in jeopardy. And you can look at these two statements as, in a way, the conditional clauses in the answer to the question you gave. So would Putin use nuclear weapons? And if you were to follow the doctrine, you would say, yes, if Russia has been attacked with nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction. And yes, if conventional aggression against Russia threatens the very existence of the state, or if the very existence of the state is put in jeopardy. This raises a question which Nisha Tsitkin, with whom I exchange materials and views, how does one define a situation in which the very existence of the state is in jeopardy? Where is the point at which that threat becomes a real threat to be dealt with? And one might think of this as maybe a US prompt global strike against Russian ICBMs with conventional warheads, or a ground war in which Russia is being defeated. But I think it's striking that in his speech of February the 24th, Putin said, and I quote, "The problem is that in territories adjacent to Russia, which I have to state is our historical land, a hostile anti-Russia is taking shape, fully controlled from the outside. It is doing everything to attract NATO armed forces and obtain cutting-edge weapons. For the United States and its allies, it's a policy of containing Russia with obvious geopolitical dividends. For our country, it is a matter of life and death, a matter of our historical future as a nation. This is not an exaggeration. This is a fact. and this I want to emphasize now, it's not only a very real threat to our interests, but to the very existence of our state and to its sovereignty. It's the red line which we have spoken about on numerous occasions. They have crossed it. So essentially, I would summarize this by saying a hostile anti-Russia is being created in our historical land, fully controlled by the US and its allies. It's a threat to the very existence of our state. They have crossed a red line that we had warned them about. And that comes very close, to my mind, to the definition of the second condition under which Russia would reserve the right to use nuclear weapons, the very existence of the state being put in jeopardy. And you may say, this is, and I might say, this is nonsense. I mean, Russia invaded Ukraine. What are we talking about here? And I think to understand it requires trying to understand the context in which this decision was taken, and to look at a strain of Russian nationalism, which has begun to receive more attention recently. But I think on the whole, we have tended, and I include myself in this, we have tended to ignore in looking at Russian politics since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it's a tradition that I would call a form of Russian exceptionalism, which brings together different themes. It's a tradition in which the Russian state and Russian statehood are absolutely key. It's not a state, nation state like the European model, and it draws its strength from the diversity of its vast territory and its Asian as well as its European heritage. It has its own special place in the world and a redemptive mission, as in defeating Nazism in World War II, claims to embody cultural and spiritual values that place it on a higher level than Europe and the West. And of course, it also makes the argument that Ukraine or Ukrainians are part of this Russian world with no right to independence. So when Putin makes that point, he's not plucking it out of thin air. There is an intellectual and political tradition which makes that assertion. It's not to justify it, it's just to try to say there is a context in which some of the more bizarre statements coming from the Russian leadership can be interpreted. And the writers whom Putin has cited occasionally in interviews include Ivan Ilyin, who was an emigre, part of the white emigration after the revolution, bitterly anti-Soviet, who argued the post-Soviet constitution, writing in the 1950s, should combine the best of autocracy with the best of democracy, which sounds a little bit like Vladislav Suvorov's idea of sovereign democracy. You can have democracy as long as it doesn't, as it were, break up the state. Nikolai Berdyaev, the Russian idea. Lev Gumilyov, Russia is a super ethnos. And as I say, I think we've paid too little attention to that line of thinking, and I think it's a very worrying aspect of the current situation. But my final point, very briefly, is that, of course, all kinds of other factors will enter into any decision to use nuclear weapons. The state of mind of the Russian leadership, the state of the war and the balance of forces, the likely military response to any use of nuclear weapons, the likely global political response to the first use of nuclear weapons in war in 77 years. So I'm not arguing that this kind of nationalist tradition that I've referred to, I mean, I think it's a particular tradition, is determinative, but I think it's an element, and a very worrying element, of the current situation that we have perhaps not paid sufficient attention to. And I will briefly answer the question you asked me, Steve. Putin in 2012 wrote an article, this was prior to his re-election as president after Medvedev's stint, in which in the first sentence he says, we will of course strengthen our strategic deterrent forces. They have been so important to us. In the 1990s, they were the only thing we had to rely on. And it's an absolutely remarkable statement. It's not just prestige. There is an image of Russia being broken up, and the one thing we have really important for us is strategic nuclear forces.
Thank you. Scott?
I believe that the likelihood of Russian nuclear use today is less than it was back in late February, early March, when forces were on the doorstep of Kyiv and the offense bogged down, and the war aim included the overthrow of the government and possible taking over of the whole country. It's less probable today because, as you all know, the war aim seems to have been narrowed to seizing and annexing potentially the Donbass, and that's where the forces are, and that would be it makes less sense to use a nuclear weapon in a territory that you're seeking to annex. However, unlikely things happen all the time, and many of us, myself included, thought it was unlikely that Russia would actually go ahead with the invasion. Many scholars and other observers thought it was unlikely that the Russians would get so bogged down and have to change their war aims. Unlikely things happen, and it behooves us to think through what should we do if Russia decides to use nuclear weapons. President Biden, I think, was appropriately vague in saying that there would be severe consequences because you don't want to lock yourself in. But as an independent observer, we want to at least think through. And Steve asked me, how should the United States respond if Russians use a nuclear weapon? And I have a clear and simple answer. It depends. Depends on what kinds of use we're thinking about. What is the scenario? What is the potential use? 4 possible uses. 1, people have often talked about a demonstration strike. A demonstration strike in an isolated area, perhaps in the Black Sea, that would not kill any individuals, or perhaps very, very few. I think that's exceedingly unlikely. Demonstration strikes may make sense if you're trying to demonstrate that you have a capability that people aren't sure you have a capability. That's why we thought about it in 1945, decided against it for a number of reasons, including that we didn't have very many weapons at the time and didn't want to waste one of them, one of the 3 that we had available in August. But I think a demonstration strike in that kind of way would show irresolution rather than commitment to escalate further. And therefore, if it is done, if they do something that stupid, I would suggest that the United States and NATO should ignore it militarily and use their breaking of the nuclear taboo or the nuclear tradition of non-use to rally international opinion even more so against the Russian regime. Under these scenarios, I think we would say the Russian use of nuclear weapons. I would hope that we would say the Russian use of a nuclear weapon would be condemned as unjustified, a grave threat to international peace and security, but it would not necessarily cause us to have a different military policy than what we have today. What if, however, it's used against a military base, like an airfield, or in a battlefield use? Then I think we should consider a change in our policy. David didn't use the term, but it's often used about the strategy of escalate to de-escalate, which I don't find shocking that the Russians have that as a doctrine. That, after all, has been the United States doctrine for throughout the Cold War and even in the post-Cold War world, the possibility of using nuclear weapons first if a war is going badly, trying to de-escalate it afterwards. I think our policy or our doctrine should be to escalate to direct military engagement, but de-escalate on the kinds of weapons. What do I mean here? Well, we have thus far been very cautious to limit our military actions to supporting Ukraine, both with arms and if you read the papers in terms of
Hello?
leaks, with direct aid in terms of intelligence and some targeting information. In that sense, the Russian threat to escalate has worked. It's limited our willingness to use forces directly. If they use nuclear weapons against Ukraine, I think that we should consider a variety of direct military actions. This would be escalating by directly being engaged, but de-escalating by making it only conventional. The targets chosen should be based on the situation on the ground, but could include Russian forces in the Ukraine. That would be direct engagement. Could include Russian Navy ships in the Black Sea. That would be, I think, a little less escalatory, but would still be a serious conventional option, and could include military targets inside Russia. The other option would be to target the base from which a Russian nuclear strike was launched. And here I would just note that there is a precedent for this in US war games. In 2016, the second Obama administration held a war game in Washington in which the deputies of the National Security Council were given a situation not in Ukraine, but in the Baltics, in which the Russians militarily intervened. A war with NATO ensued, and the Russians used a single nuclear weapon against a NATO airbase. The deputies, after a long debate, chose to launch a conventional attack, presumably, although the details aren't clear, against the base inside Russia from which the attack had occurred. The principals the next day then met, were given the same war game scenario. They chose to use nuclear weapons instead. And when told by the red team, the intelligence team playing the Russians, that would be considered by the Russians to be attack on the homeland by the United States, requiring a response against the United States, the deputies changed their minds and decided to use 3 nuclear weapons against Belarus, even though Belarus had not been involved in the war. Avril Haines, the Deputy National Security Advisor, reportedly, according to Fred Kaplan's book, The Bomb, made T-shirts saying the deputies had the right answer. And I think basically the instinct is the right one, is to use conventional weapons, escalate to direct military engagement, but de-escalate in the kinds of weaponry used. What if instead they use nuclear weapons against a Ukrainian city to create terror and send a message that hostilities must be promptly concluded, call for unconditional surrender? That seems preposterous to some, but as anybody who's studied the Second World War knows, that's basically what the United States did in 1945, rather than continue on with the planned invasion. And here I think, again, we should both consider offensive conventional responses, but we should also point out ahead of time that this use would be illegal. The other uses might not be illegal, at least by most interpretations of international law. And I see that Professor Weiner is here. He and I have written about potential legal uses of nuclear weapons. They might be legal but unfortunate, or lawful but awful. This would be an illegal use of nuclear weapons because it would be deliberately targeting civilians. We should be telling, in my judgment, the Russian military quietly through private communications that any use of a nuclear weapon against a city is a war crime, and that officers who implement such an order, not just the political leader who issued an order, would be a war criminal. The US has a long history since Nuremberg of tracking down and eventually punishing war criminals. That kind of threat might just add a sliver of personal deterrence to Russian officers who already might not want to implement such an order for strategic reasons. And if that sounds grim, just think about what the alternatives are. I'll conclude there.
Thank you. Rose.
Thank you. Steve asked me to comment on NATO policy, and I will do so. I have a few other remarks. I'd like to begin by noting the way I think about this question of what are the chances. I think we have, or I think about it as I think about nuclear terrorism. The chances are small. People often say under 1% of a nuclear terrorist attack on the United States, but the consequences are so extreme that we have to take the possibility very, very seriously. I frankly think the chances of nuclear use are greater than 1%, but they're not 10%. But the consequences of Putin using a nuclear weapon, a single nuclear weapon in any way, whether a demonstration strike or in any of the ways Scott listed, we have to take it extremely seriously because, as the president said yesterday, and I'll just quote once again, that the nuclear saber rattling rhetoric is dangerous and extremely irresponsible. And it would be completely unacceptable to us as well as to the rest of the world, entailing severe consequences. So we've heard that quote already from David this morning, but I think it's good that the president has gone out in that way and now made those remarks. Turning to NATO, its public stance has been very similar to that of the United States. Its main point has been that the alliance does not see confrontation with Russia and is doing everything it can to prevent Russia's war from escalating beyond Ukraine and becoming more deadly. We've had Jens Stoltenberg in Washington even today. He is there for a visit for the next couple of days. There will be a public speech tomorrow at CSIS, which I'll be watching with great interest. But he was preceded in this trip by NATO's Deputy Secretary General, Mircea Geowana, who was speaking to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly in Vilnius just this past Monday. And he said, condemning the escalatory language coming out of Moscow, that we don't see any signs in military terms of Russia preparing to use nuclear weapons, tactical or others. So that was a message, I think, that was important coming, both talking to the parliamentarians, but then bolstered today by what Sec Gen Stoltenberg said in Washington when he reminded Putin that Putin had recently signed up to the statement that nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought, the famous Reagan-Gorbachev statement from the mid-1980s, which ironically the Russians just signed up to again in January of 2022, 1 month before the invasion, as a prelude to the NPT review conference coming up in August. It was done as a P5 matter. All the nuclear weapon states under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, China, United States, UK, France, as well as Russia, signing up to this statement together. But it's interesting to me, and looking back over what NATO has been saying in the recent months, that again and again Stoltenberg has been reminding Putin of this language, and it's interesting, I think, just in terms of what has seemed important from Brussels headquarters. So, talking about the Reagan-Gorbachev formulation this morning, Stoltenberg said, as such, we know that he knows that any nuclear use would totally change the situation, and that is why nuclear weapons should not be used. Over these months, NATO has also been reiterating its nuclear declaratory policy, I think in a useful way. This is language that has been out there forever. I don't expect it to change much as the NATO strategic concept is worked in preparation for the Madrid summit of NATO at the end of this month. There'll be a lot of things that NATO does with that strategic concept. One thing I'll just comment amusingly, NATO was all ready to shift to Asia, not in terms of physically moving its activities to Asia, but in trying to look for ways to backfill for the United States and Europe and pay more attention to China in the way that it talks about its responsibilities and missions. But as a matter of fact, now I think the strategic concept will again reiterate the threats in Europe, and there will be something about NATO and its concerns about China, but that balance, I think, has shifted back toward focusing on Europe. And so I don't think the strategic concept will really change that much also in terms of how NATO sees its center of gravity and where it places its priorities. Different questions for Washington, of course, that balance these days, but as far as NATO is concerned, I think the focus will be squarely on Europe. But just reiterating the nuclear declaratory language that NATO uses, the purpose of our nuclear capabilities is to preserve peace, prevent coercion, and deter aggression. NATO will continue to take steps to ensure our nuclear deterrent capabilities remain safe, secure, credible, and effective, even in the face of Russian threats. And even though the circumstances in which NATO might have to use nuclear weapons are extremely remote, any employment of nuclear weapons would fundamentally alter the nature of conflict. And that extremely remote language is also very much present in US declaratory policy. It will come out again in the nuclear posture review, I am certain, from what I've seen from the Defense Department public statements on this matter, when the nuclear posture review is finally released to the public. So I think in some ways, most importantly, though, what NATO has done recently is also take military defensive steps in order to bolster its own resilience. Again, when NATO had its special meeting of leaders back in March, on March 24th, Stoltenberg announced that SACEUR, General Walters, has activated NATO's chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear defense elements, and allies are deploying additional chemical and biological and nuclear defenses to reinforce our existing and new battle groups. That is, these steps were taken not only in the Baltic states and Poland, the original 4 battle groups, but also in the newly announced battle groups in Southern Europe, in Bulgaria and Romania. So it's an important, I think, message militarily. It's a kind of deterrence by denial message. And you may say, oh, CBRN defense measures cannot be that important. But I think it falls well in line with what NATO and the United States has been doing since the beginning of this crisis. That is to get the message out to Moscow of no impunity. You cannot get away with this. So, of course, again, rhetorically, we've got this language out there that it would be extraordinary. It would really change the situation. And as Scott so ably noted, in ways that the US would have to think through hard with its allies how to respond. But nevertheless, I think this notion of some deterrence measures by denial, the kind of building up of CBRN defensive measures among actively deployed NATO troops is also an important part of that message to Moscow of no impunity. Finally, I'd just like to briefly comment about this whole question of breaking the nuclear taboo. And I think I agree with Scott that I think the saber rattling has receded a bit in the last month, and certainly on May 9th, when we expected at the Victory Day speech in Moscow for Putin again to be engaging in nuclear saber rattling and being very pugnacious, he struck a much more, I would say, measured stance, and also his reaction to Stockholm and Helsinki applying for NATO membership. Also a very kind of measured response, when I expected a lot more of a fire-breathing response from him. So I have been thinking that there's been some aspect of messaging going into the Kremlin that's been useful about breaking the nuclear taboo and what that would mean for Moscow. The nuclear taboo, of course, has existed for 75 plus years now, since the United States dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And therefore, the moral responsibility for the only use of nuclear weapons in wartime rests on the shoulders of the United States. And of course, we've borne that all this time with, I think, a very measured approach to it all. But over the years of Soviet and Russian propaganda, they've made a great deal of hay out of this, and repeatedly made a great deal of hay out of it. If this nuclear taboo should be broken by the Russian Federation, with Putin responsible for the decision, I think it does shift that moral responsibility onto the shoulders of Russia, number one, but furthermore inflames the global South, which has responded with a fair degree of relaxation to what the Russians have been doing in Ukraine. But the global South, I think, is very concerned, and I have colleagues who have been working on the nuclear weapons-free zones in the global South, but they've been very focused on ensuring that the nuclear threats do not grow in the 20th century and now in the 21st century. So I think that there would be definitely more of a reaction to that kind of a global reaction, I want to stress, to a nuclear use by Putin, and could, I think, also lead to the kind of reaction among those who have been rather relaxed about what Russia has been up to this point. So I look forward to our discussion. And again, Steve, thank you very much for convening us today.
Oh, thank you. Well, let me take the moderator's program and pose a couple of questions to begin. I'll start, David, let me start with you. Is that, as you said, in Russian declaratory doctrine, the second circumstances is if there's a conventional war in which the existence of the Russian state is at stake. And I could concede that Russia could lose this war, or fail in its objectives. And the Russian state would still survive. It would not be existential to the Russian state itself, but it might be existential to Vladimir Putin in terms of his leadership. How much should we worry about the conflation in the Kremlin of sort of Putin's existence and the Russian state's existence?
Yes, we should worry about that, I think, because the position that he has put himself in, I think, is as defender of a Russian statehood that essentially claims that Ukrainians don't have a right to independence. Ukraine is part of the Russian world, maybe not necessarily totally annexed into Russia, but subordinate to Russia in some way. So I think for him, these two things are likely combined. I'm not sure how he would think about it as, do I have to go on with this ridiculous thing just because people will throw me out if I don't? I doubt very much. But that entails reading his psychology, and I think that if you're in power that long in that position, you identify with the state. You're not separate from it. Anyway, that would be my.
Okay. Scott, let me ask you a question. You spent time at the Pentagon, and I think some of the good news in the last two and a half weeks is both Secretary Austin and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Milley have had phone conversations with their Russian counterparts, things that I guess they tried to do early on in February and March, and they weren't having that opportunity. But how likely was it that in those conversations that they might specifically be talking about this nuclear question and sort of trying to convey messages that that action would indeed be unacceptable?
I have no idea of what the chairman or others have said in communications. I do think what they have said publicly, or what they have done publicly, is appropriately sending a calming message. So, for example, right after the Russian forces exercises, we were planning a launch out of Vandenberg of test ICBMs, something that's quite routine. I know that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, we did launch test missiles out of Vandenberg without thinking maybe the Russians might misinterpret that, especially since we had loaded up other missiles at Vandenberg with nuclear warheads before we launched the test one towards the Kwajalein Atoll. The Pentagon was criticized for its cautious decision not to launch test missiles. I think it was utterly the appropriate thing to do, is to say we're going to do everything possible to calm this situation, rather than respond to Russian threats. So I think the Pentagon has, by and large, from their public actions, has done the appropriate thing, saying nuclear weapons should not be involved here. We do know that there is a Tiger team that's trying to think through some of the potential responses, and I'm just doing my own guesswork about what I think the United States should do under those circumstances, but in no way am I familiar with what the Pentagon is actually planning.
Rose, you spent time in Moscow. one thing that it seems to me is just watching the nuclear talk coming out of Russia is that while you've had, of course, President Putin did the nuclear alert, Lavrov said some things, the pundits are talking, but I haven't seen any comments on this by senior Russian military figures. How should we read that? Is that also reassuring or?
Yes, that's a lot of guesswork. Two quick comments. I just want to say to carry on Scott's point, it's been very interesting to me in recent interactions with Chinese scholars that they have been very complimentary of the way in measured steps that the United States has responded, and they've expressed alarm themselves about the nuclear saber rattling, but they have specifically praised the cancellation of that ICBM test, as well as the way the United States has responded rhetorically, and the fact that there are these lines of communication open between the Pentagon and the MOD and the General Staff in Russia. So I thought that was an interesting facet of this current situation that bears watching, how the Chinese are considering this this whole nuclear saber rattling scenario. It is interesting that we're not hearing much from, not hearing anything on this score from the military. My own point of view, I cannot comment because I do not know exactly, but my own view is, having worked with the Russian military over the years, including the Strategic Rocket Forces and the 12th Main Directorate of the General Staff, the nuclear warhead people, as well as the Nuclear Navy and the Nuclear Air Force, is that they are top-notch professionals. They understand the command and control of their nuclear forces. They understand that they need to be safe, secure, and effective. That's all that work we did with them for many, many years on cooperative threat reduction. They are responsible actors. So if there is to be some kind of facet of more, or balance of more responsible thinking rather than saber rattling in Moscow, I would invest it in those professional actors in the uniformed ranks. But again, I am completely speculating. I don't have any evidence of this separately. But the fact that they have taken steps that are not in fact, and actually it was Misha Sipkin, I think, who commented on this via Twitter when he said, oh, how interesting, when the nuclear alert came back in February. He said, actually, this is something where they put extra personnel in the command posts of the nuclear forces, rather than actually upping the operational readiness of the missiles themselves. So Sipkin commented that this is a case where Putin needed something done, and so they gave him something, but it did not actually have an implication for the operational readiness of the nuclear forces, which that fact has been reemphasized again and again, including in the president's op-ed in the New York Times yesterday.
Okay. Well, let me go ahead and open it up for questions.
Yeah, my name is Paul Gregory. I'm with Hoover. I'd like to ask.
Well, can you wait for the microphone?
Oh,
Because that it can be done, therefore, in a way that the Zoom audience.
My name is Paul Gregory. I'm with Hoover, and perhaps one of you can answer my question. Given concern about an aberrant and perhaps ill Putin, namely the actual chain of command to launch some kind of nuclear weapon.
Well, let me comment. One is the president is the person with the authority to launch nuclear weapons. There are reported to be 3 footballs, or Russians, little suitcases. One with the president, one with the chief of the general staff, one with the Minister of Defense. And at least in reports I've seen, I have no access to secret information. You would need, the president couldn't do it just on his own. The orders would go through either one of the others or both of the others. I've seen both suggested. I do know that the military were concerned about Yeltsin and about the situation in which he might give an order. And they took some precautions to make sure that they knew what state he was in if he gave an order. There's maybe a parallel with General Milley and Donald Trump, but I think, again, it would be military responsibility it would fit in with some notion of responsibility to make sure, it wasn't Yeltsin in his cups giving an order not meant to be taken seriously, or maybe meant to be taken seriously. So anyway, that's.
Do any of the others have comments they might make on my question?
I would only say I agree with what David had to say, but Bruce Blair did some work on this, interviewing former Strategic Rocket Forces officers and so forth. So there is a little bit of literature on it, and Bruce's work, I think, is worth reviewing.
I would just say that from what I understand, the Russian system is not very different from the US system. That the president has the authority. The difference in the US is that actually it's probably less constrained in that the president could go directly to the could go through the chairman, or could go above the chairman if to Stratcom directly. Fortunately, the General John Hyten, when he was commander at Stratcom, said that it was his responsibility not to follow an illegal order. And if he believed the president was issuing an illegal order, he said that he would tell the president that and say that I can't implement that. Tell me what it is that you want to do. What's the purpose? And let's see if we can find a legal way of doing that. Now, under some of these different scenarios, the bad news is that some of them might be legal. The good news is that there's at least a possibility that a Russian general would have that same sensitivity and would say, sir, this doesn't make sense. I want to find out if there's an alternative that could meet our needs without escalating to the use of nuclear weapons.
Jim.
Thanks so much for this great presentation. Rose, question for you, which is, could you tell us a little bit about what the Russian ongoing obligations are under New START, and what they're doing under that tells you about their attitudes?
That's an excellent point that you reminded me of, Jim. It's very interesting that since this crisis has begun, the Russians have continued very carefully to implement their obligations under New START. Anytime an ICBM is moved in the Russian system, for example, from a deployment site to a maintenance facility, the Russians have to send us a notification through the nuclear risk reduction centers. Their NERC is located at the MOD in Moscow, and ours is located at the Department of State. They have been continuing to send regular notifications of the routine movements of their strategic nuclear forces. And so we have been receiving at our NERC in Washington a lot of notifications. And so we have a good 24/7 picture of what is going on inside the Russian strategic nuclear forces, which I think in itself has a kind of confidence building, predictability building aspect to it during this period of nuclear saber rattling. I was astonished to hear recently that on one single day, there were 18 notifications received at the NERC in Washington. And 18 notifications, it was unprecedented, but to me, it was something of a message that they wanted to make sure, first of all, we knew they were fulfilling their New START obligations, but second, that they wanted to ensure we knew that this predictability measure under the New START treaty would continue to be implemented and would perhaps counterbalance some of this loose talk. The other thing they also did was exchange twice a year, the database is exchanged. So we have daily notifications of changes in the status of the forces, but then twice a year, a comprehensive database is exchanged. So that step was also taken. What has not been happening under New START are the on-site inspections. And that is not because of the crisis, but because of COVID, the other crisis, the pandemic crisis. And on-site inspections have not taken place for 2 years now. They are looking to, both sides are looking to convene the Bilateral Consultative Commission, the implementing body of the treaty, And I hope when that meeting takes place, the two sides will agree to resume on-site inspections. That is the plan. So we will see what happens. But that, I think, continuity in the implementation of New START has been important in this context that we've been discussing today.
Okay, let me take a question from Zoom. This comes from Amy Wolf, who used to work on a lot of these issues and was the Congressional Research Services expert on these questions. She says, we've talked about a possibility where the Russians might deliberately use a nuclear weapon in the scenarios that Scott outlined. What kind of risks do we see that perhaps that nuclear use might be unintended because either miscalculation, misinterpretation, miscommunication? How big is the risk now? And are there things that the US and NATO should be doing to sort of mitigate that risk?
I don't have a comment on miscalculation. I do have a comment on accidental use. But clearly the Russian military has shown itself to be far less competent operationally than people presumed. Certainly than Western observers presumed, and I assume less so than Vladimir Putin assumed. One good piece of news about the lack of action operationally with nuclear weapons is that they haven't taken weapons out of storage igloos in terms of theater or tactical, so-called tactical nuclear weapons. Those are things that are more likely, again, this is still low probability, but more likely to have an accident occur if you have weapons that are out in the field, are being moved around by truck, are being put into battlefield conditions where they become more operationally ready. I don't know how to assess the probability of that, but I do think it is good news that we have not seen any such actions taking place in Russia.
At the beginning of the invasion, I was much more concerned about the possibility of a nuclear power plant incident because the Russians were actively attacking Novorossiysk, I'm sorry, not Novorossiysk, the Zaporizhzhia power plant in a shocking way, and of course marched into Chernobyl, and that had disastrous results for their own troops becoming irradiated over the month that they were bivouacked there. So I've been much more concerned about that for the very reason that Scott named. That is, as far as we know, and we've been watching very closely, the non-strategic, the tactical nuclear weapons have not come out of central storage, and so are not deployed forward with the troops.
Okay. John Woodworth, who also worked on these questions at the Office of the Secretary of Defense, poses the question. We've talked about sort of scenarios for the use by Russia of nuclear weapon against Ukraine. What if it was a use by Russia of a nuclear weapon against a NATO target, say against one of the bases in Poland, from which I assume weapons are being gathered and being shipped into Ukraine?
This is a very interesting phenomenon. We've talked about NATO being self-deterred during this period, but I think Russia has been self-deterred from attacking directly NATO targets again and again and again. We've had Deputy Foreign Minister Rybkov trotted out to warn about, we consider these convoys to be targets that are legitimate and strategic targets for us, et cetera. This another occurrence this morning in a Kommersant interview that he gave. So I think the Russians are frankly self-deterred. It doesn't mean they're not attacking the weapons every chance they get once they're inside Ukraine, but so far they have held back from attacking NATO targets, and I believe they will continue to hold back against attacking targets inside NATO territory.
I mean, I think, sorry, this goes to the issue of the limits in the war. I mean, of course, there are great pressures to extend the limits, for example. And there may well be people in Moscow saying, why don't we attack those targets? But that then opens it up to, escalation of then, what will the NATO response be? What would the US response be? So
especially now they've seen their own conventional forces so ground up in Ukraine, they don't have a lot to throw at NATO.
Oh, exactly. So I think one of the interesting things about the president's letter is, in a way, spelling out or trying to spell out the limits or the boundary between this limited war and a more general war that really, I think nobody wants. Russia doesn't want, right? Not just US.
Okay, Alan and then Chip. Oh, oh no, no. That's a,
Alan Weiner from Stanford Law School. Wonderful presentation. Two very quick questions. One for Scott Sagan. In response to the question, should the U.S. use nuclear weapons or NATO use nuclear weapons? You said the answer was, it depends. But if I listen to your analysis of the different scenarios, it seemed like the answer is, in fact, no. Am I missing something? Is there any scenario in which you believe the use of responsive nuclear weapons would be appropriate? And for David, terrifying to hear your gloss on, the doctrine, which I sort of thought like, oh, well, there's nothing to worry about here. But in any event, does doctrine matter for Putin, or will the use of nuclear weapons simply be based on what President Putin believes is in his or Russia's interests?
Well, as you know, Alan, since you and I have written together about this, I do think there are appropriate uses of nuclear weapons, but they're very, very limited. And I could imagine, for example, if there was a target inside Russia, say some central storage site that we thought lots of weapons were coming out, and Russians had started using them, I would want to attack that target. That would be a legitimate target. If it could be taken out with even moderate confidence with conventional weapons, that would be the preferred thing to do. If, however, it was buried to such a degree that only a nuclear weapon could destroy it, I think that should be considered. That is a very limited and unlikely particular target, but I think it would be a legal one and could be justified strategically if a nuclear war had already started and the Russians were using nuclear weapons. But I would want to take into account whether conventional weapons could do the job. And if that's the case, then the principle of necessity, or otherwise called the principle of precaution, would suggest that we should use the weapon that would kill the fewest civilians in the surrounding area. And if we can do it that way, that would be vastly preferred.
On the question of doctrine, I don't think doctrine determines decisions. And so it's perfectly possible that in some situation, Putin would decide, oh, we need to use nuclear weapons, and say this is, and indeed even pick the targets if some of the reports about his involvement in decision making are true. But the doctrine does reflect internal discussion and debate about the use of nuclear weapons. And I think that's not irrelevant to thinking. I mean, the military certainly involved, the Security Council involved, and Putin himself involved. So I think that thinking is there to shape the way in which they've been thinking about the use of nuclear weapons. But it's certainly not, it certainly doesn't exclude the possibility of a decision taken in a crisis which doesn't relate to doctrine.
Yep.
So I have a question that's kind of a follow-on to David's response to Alan's, but I'd like to hear from all four of you on this. In reading the Biden op-ed, probably not a big surprise, I was focused on the drafting process and how carefully every word was chosen to convey a set of messages. And just so I can reveal my own bias here, I was very struck by the paragraph devoted to prospective nuclear use and how it ended. If you reduce it, it says, don't do this because there will be severe consequences, period. So again, don't do it. Well, I'm not sure that, my guess is that that was a compromise in terms of the exact language chosen. So the issue, the four of you that respond to this, is what was your response, not just to that paragraph, but to the whole speech? Too hawkish, too dovish, or more or less just right?
I thought it was pretty just about right. The severe consequences language had already been used by National Security Advisor, and he was repeating them. And what is appropriate here is to avoid what I've called the commitment trap problem, where you say something to add a bit of oomph to your deterrent threat. That event happens, and then feel like you're committed to doing something. So had the president said we would respond in kind, for example, which some people would say, I think that would be inappropriate, because there may be circumstances, as I suggested, where you don't want to respond.
I dare
in
you.
kind.
That's I dare you
Yeah.
kind of language. Yeah.
And so I think leaving it to be severe consequences. I've thought about adding swift and severe, but swift might make you do a more rash decision. So I think it was about right.
Maybe I'll comment that I really like the language on negotiation. I agree with what Scott said, but I like the language on negotiation because there's been a lot of back and forth in the community, Chip, as you know, recently about, should the Ukrainians be forced to, you can't force anybody to the negotiating table anyway, but, should we be pushing them in that direction? And I really like the way the president said, we are creating the conditions that will make it right. I'm paraphrasing, but it will be the right time then for the Ukrainians to go to the table. And I liked that formulation.
It's very boring. I liked the phrasing as well. And I thought on the nuclear issue, severe consequences is the appropriate way to do it for reasons given. What I liked was what I thought, indeed the headline suggests, is it's an attempt to say, this is the war we're fighting. We're not fighting another war, and we don't want to get into that other war. So although there's obviously the message of resilience and support for Ukraine, there's also, in some sense, a reassuring message for Russia. This is not about destroying you. This is the war we're fighting.
And it's not about regime change.
It's not about regime change, and it's not about us telling Ukrainians what to do. I agree with you. That was kind of very important to say that. So I thought it was very skillfully done. And I noticed that there was, I heard or read one Russian response from Medvedev saying this was a kind of rational piece. So I think they will read
I haven't
it.
seen that.
Well, maybe I'm dreaming that up because he's been pretty hysterical in other ways.
Yeah, I'll just make it 4 for 4. No, I think it really was a speech that, or an op-ed that was, they really crafted every word. And it was designed to send messages not only to the American public, but to Russia, to Ukraine, to allies. And I think they hit all the right notes. So, okay, let me take one from Zoom. Kimberly Martin raises a question, I guess, for you, David. Says, does Putin see his own regime as equivalent of the Ukraine state? I mean, you touched on that. And that, would that lead to the fact that if she asks, if there were an attempt internally to remove him, if say some of the guys in the circle said, this has become too much of a disaster, might he see that as sort of, again, such a threat to him that he then might use nuclear weapons in that circumstance? And we won't expect a definitive answer on that one, but
no, it's possible that in a political crisis, if he thought his own position and the position of Russia was being betrayed, that he would engineer some action or maybe use a nuclear weapon on the calculation that that would kind of rally the Russians around him. And this comes back to an issue of miscalculation. I mean, Russia's entry into the war, Russia's attack on Ukraine, seems to have rested on at least 2 very serious miscalculations, one about the Ukrainian response, one about the Western response. And that's actually a very worrying issue. What if, what frame of mind he's in? He's rather isolated with a very small, apparently a very small group of advisors that he talks to. What if they say, oh, the whole house is coming down? Let's do something drastic to try to change the situation. It's not impossible, but the trouble is we get into, it's very hard to say that anything is impossible But this surely is not my most immediate nightmare about the use of nuclear weapons.
Okay. All right, we have another question which sort of follows on that question from Nora Bensahel, who is a CISAC fellow. And she raises the question, if it appears now that the Russian military is not going to be capable of using conventional forces of achieving what appeared to be its original goal in terms of taking Kyiv and a good chunk of Ukraine. But I guess, David, do you see any scenario in which Russian nuclear use might advance sort of the nationalist perspective that you described in your opening comments?
I think that one reading of what has happened is that this decision has been a catastrophe for Russia and sets back the nationalist cause by essentially uniting Ukrainians against Russia, so that the very notion of a kind of Russian world embracing Ukraine now seems much more distant than it did even 4 months ago. So I think that it's, to me, very unlikely to see nuclear use as reversing that trend. I think people would say, no, this is just getting us in deeper. And I think, I mean, my sense of Russian military thinking is much less founded on evidence and interaction than Rose's is. But I have a similar view that they don't regard these weapons as somehow trivial, or would not think of using them in a frivolous way. And I could see that there would be opposition. There would be real question in what kind of goal is this going to achieve.
Right. Okay, we've got about 5 minutes, so I'm going to take 3 quick questions. Louis, Tom, and then I'll take one from the Zoom. And I'll take them all at once and then let you all answer.
Thanks for the presentations. They were very interesting. With the Red Cup coming, there are a lot of TPNW, especially advocates and disarmament advocates, are saying that we wouldn't be having this conversation if nuclear weapons didn't exist. With the Red Cup coming, how is the U.S. responding, or should the U.S. respond to this kind of charges that are going to come during the meetings in August? And I guess that as a negotiator in residence, this question might be for you, Rose.
Tom?
It's a great discussion. I return to the messaging, message sent and message received. That Steve's summary of Biden's 4 notes with respect to what the United States will do has an implicit for now under these conditions. And I wonder if part of the intent or the part of the message received would be among the things that would change, that could be some type of use of a nuclear device. Related to that is, to me, murky question of whether the response would be a US response or a NATO response. And if the presumption is a NATO response where NATO would have to concur in the use of presumably US nuclear weapons, if that is not seen as a vulnerability perhaps worth exploiting or exploring by Moscow.
Okay, and let me just toss in one last question that comes from Peter Verpica online. He says, notes that in the past 3 or 4 months, we've seen lots of concern on the part of the West about possible Russian false flag operations. Is there any scenario that you could see in which the Russians might either use a nuclear device or, say, a radiological device, but do it in such a way as to disguise it wouldn't clearly be Russian, as an attempt then to sort of make it more difficult for the United States and NATO to respond? So let me toss those 3 questions out and maybe start in reverse order. Rose, do you want to respond first?
Okay. Luis, I agree with you. The TPNW advocates are out in force and are really going to be pressing the non-NPT community very, very hard. And because so many TPNW partisans are also NPT non-nuclear weapon states. Essentially, all of this is directed at the nuclear weapon states. So to my mind, the absolute vital thing is for as many of the P5 to be pulling together in preparation for the NPT review conference as possible. And if we can get Russia to cooperate, we should. We should be reiterating that January statement. We should be taking steps, perhaps parallel unilateral steps, to reinforce the message that we are continuing to be committed to the disarmament pillar of the NPT, because otherwise I fear that we will simply be, we could also in the face of the horizontal proliferation pressures coming out of this Ukraine crisis, we could be seeing the beginning of the end for the NPT. So we really need to think hard about this, and there are a number of good proposals out there about how we might work together, and particularly to try to get the Chinese to do some more heavy lifting in this run-up period, June, July, before the August RevCon. So far, they have not seemed particularly ready to do so, but I continue to be hopeful that they will begin to want to work together to try to preserve the NPT and its surrounding system of treaties and agreements and processes. So we will see what happens, but I agree with you. I think it's a problem that is a significant one. And so we'll need to be thinking hard about that. Tom, my own sense in your message, it circles back to what Scott was talking about earlier. That is, the U.S. will want to maintain, I think, maximum flexibility to consider how to respond in that context. And so NATO decision-making procedures are complex, but I would think that the United States would want that on the table, the possibility that NATO might be involved in a response. But I can see there being a certain preference for U.S. response undertaken, basically on its own recognizance. So that, but that then implicates the central strategic forces, obviously. So there's that question in there as well. So I think in the end of the day, when I think about, I agree that the message would change if nuclear use were perpetrated by the Russian Federation, but in the end of the day, I come down, I think, pretty firmly on the side that Scott has been laying out, that conventional responses with strategic effect would be what the United States and its NATO allies should reach for in that circumstance. Peter's question is very interesting. I think getting for a false flag operation involving a nuclear warhead, it would be very difficult to implement that, because all of those nuclear warheads mercifully went back to Russia. So Ukraine doesn't have any. A radiological device is another matter, and that could be a serious, I would think, scenario.
And the false flag, I'd also just add that ChemBio would be a serious false flag, because that's one of the things that Putin mentioned when he was talking about the need to invade Ukraine. And so they've already planted that false flag, although they have not raised it metaphorically.
But also Putin also did in his speech on the 24th and perhaps on the 21st say that Ukraine was seeking or already had nuclear weapons, which is pretty bizarre given the fact that Ukraine gave them up 30 years ago.
Correct. Again, I think trying to do something that could justify at home what he was doing. The only other comment I would make, I think the NPT review conference will be very hard, and the nuclear posture review will not help it the way that it did during the Obama administration, where the nuclear posture review was mentioned numerous times as saying the United States didn't go as far as we wanted, but they at least moved in the right direction. We know that President Biden in January 27, Vice President Biden then, in January 2017, said he saw no realistic scenario in which the first use of US nuclear weapons made any strategic sense. And then during the campaign, he said he favored a sole purpose declaration, a no first use declaration. The NPR will not do that. And we know from the Defense Department's initial statements, even though they haven't published the whole posture review, that it will say that the fundamental purpose of nuclear weapons is to deter other uses of nuclear weapons. We will try to spin that as a movement, a progressive movement, but it's not nearly as much as the president himself suggested that he wanted during the campaign. Whether the posture review would have been different had relations with Russia been better, I don't know. But I think politically it would be very hard at this period of time for any administration to say that it wants to have a sole purpose or a no first use. I would advocate that, but I also think politically it would be very, very difficult given the war.
David, last word to you.
Thank you. On the false flag operation, it seems to me that if you use nuclear weapons, part of it is to convey a message that you will not be pushed around, that you are very tough. And therefore, saying, well, no, we didn't do this, somebody else did it, is kind of depriving yourself to some degree of the impact that you want to make. So I think an attack on or cause of an accident at, say, the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, that's something that you might say, oh, it's, yes, which of course would cause a lot of death and contamination. There you might do it and say, well, of course, that's not our fault. There are all these claims about bio weapons labs in Ukraine, something there. On the issue of who decides on the response to nuclear weapons on Ukraine, I hope Ukraine would have something to say. You mentioned the US and NATO in responding.
That was another important point from the president's op-ed.
Yeah.
So, yeah, good point.
So after all, conducting a nuclear war at some distance is one thing. But the country or the area in which the nuclear exchanges might take place, that's another thing. And that arose with Eisenhower in Hungary, where he says, yeah, our using nuclear weapons isn't going to help the Hungarians. So I hope that and you're right, it's in the op-ed piece. Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, thank you all for a great discussion. I'm sorry we have to leave about 25 questions on Zoom unanswered, but next time we'll schedule this for about 4 hours one afternoon. Okay, but please join me in thanking our panel.